Frank Carter was 70 years old. He had been an English literature teacher before retiring, dedicating his life to instilling a love for words in generations of students. But now, he lived alone in a small house in the suburbs of New England, where winters were long and cold, and summers were merely fleeting warmth. His two-story wooden house with a wide porch was surrounded by a garden that no longer received careful tending. Climbing rose bushes still struggled to embrace the faded white wooden fence, weathered by time. Inside, everything remained as it had for years. An old armchair beside a bookshelf, a wooden desk cluttered with books and papers, and a table lamp casting a warm golden glow. The space carried a nostalgic beauty, yet it was steeped in loneliness. Frank had little interest in modern things. He didn't use a smartphone, had no social media accounts, and rarely even turned on the TV. He preferred writing with a fountain pen on paper rather than typing on a keyboard. Each morning, he brewed a cup of coffee, sat by the window, and reread the old books he once loved. It was the only habit that still gave his life meaning. But despite the seeming tranquility, an emptiness lingered within him. An old wound, a sorrow that had never truly faded. Frank had once loved Eleanor, the only woman in his life. She was his light, his inspiration, the reason he believed in goodness. But for some reason, they had parted ways long ago. In the years that followed, he lived, worked, and spoke to the world, yet his heart never truly forgot her. Eleanor had passed away a few years ago. The news came to Frank in a letter from an old friend. He had held it in his hands for a long time but never opened it. He couldn't bear to face the reality that she was truly gone. Yet, even without reading it, he knew what it said. A part of him had died the moment he realized he would never see her again. From that moment on, Frank became even more withdrawn. The days passed in silence, but he never imagined that some things never truly disappear. Unspoken words, memories left untouched. And then, one day, the past returned in a way he never expected. One autumn afternoon, as golden leaves covered the path, Frank decided to clean out the attic. It had been a long time since he last stepped up there. Old boxes were covered in dust, forgotten books lay untouched, and relics of a distant past rested in the shadows. He hadn't intended to search for anything, just a sudden impulse to put things in order. And then, amidst the pile of old belongings, he found a small wooden box. With trembling hands, he lifted the lid and found an old mobile phone, a model from over 20 years ago. Its silver casing was worn, its buttons faded with time, yet it remained intact. Frank couldn't remember when he had last placed it there. He didn't even think it would still work. But as he absent-mindedly pressed the power button, the screen flickered weakly, as if clinging to its last breath of life. And then, he saw something that made his heart tighten. Voicemail full, dozens of missed calls, and all of them came from one familiar name, Eleanor. Frank sat motionless. He didn't remember ever receiving these calls. He couldn't understand why they were here, why he had never seen them before. His breath quickened as his trembling fingers scrolled through the list of messages. The last message from Eleanor was sent one night, many years ago. Just a few simple words. "Frank, I need you. Please pick up before it's too late." The room suddenly felt eerily silent. It was as if someone were standing right behind him, as if Eleanor was still there, waiting for him to answer. Frank remained still, staring at the old phone screen. The unread messages from Eleanor appeared one by one, as if a door to the past had just been flung open. Each line on the screen was a fragment of memory, stirring emotions long buried. "Frank, where are you? I've been calling you all week. Are you okay? Please call me back. Frank, I really need to talk to you. Please don't ignore this message." And then the final message sent on a rainy night years ago. Frank, I need you. Please pick up before it's too late. A chill ran down Frank's spine. He tapped on the voicemail icon, his hand shaking as he played each recording Eleanor had left. Her voice filled the room. At first, strong and hopeful. Frank, it's me. I hope you still have this number. If you get this message, please call me back. Then, her voice grew softer, tinged with urgency. I know you don't like being disturbed, but this is really important. I need to see you. And finally, a quiet despair in the last words she ever left for him. Frank, if you're hearing this, then maybe I don't have much time left. I wish things had been different. Please, forgive me? Or maybe I'm the one who needs to forgive you. The phone slipped from Frank's hands. He leaned back in his chair, his heart pounding. What had happened to Eleanor that night? Why had she been so desperate? And why had he never heard these messages before? Frank closed his eyes, and the memories came rushing back, as vivid as if they had happened just yesterday. He remembered the first time he met Eleanor. She was a woman with bright eyes and a gentle smile, someone who could find joy in the smallest things. They had spent countless afternoons walking along the New England shore, letting the wind tangle their hair and the sand slip between their fingers. They had written letters to each other when they were apart, letters filled with love and thoughts on life. And every evening, they had sat together, reading the books they both adored. But then, those happy memories were pushed aside by something else, the reason they had drifted apart. Frank remembered that night, the night when everything fell apart. An argument, a terrible misunderstanding, a moment of anger that led to words he could never take back. Eleanor had left in tears, and Frank had let his pride keep him from going after her. He had always told himself there would be time to make amends. But life moved on, and that time never came. Now, with this old phone in his hands, Frank realized a bitter truth. Eleanor had never truly left him. She had searched for him, had called him, had tried desperately to reconnect. And he had not been there. Frank felt as if he couldn't breathe. Eleanor was gone. He would never be able to answer those messages, never be able to call her back. But there was one thing he could still do. He could find out what had really happened to Eleanor that night. The next morning, Frank left his house, carrying the old phone, the only trace of Eleanor that remained. He set out on a journey, retracing the places that had meant something to both of them. First, he went to the old cafe where they had spent hours talking, sharing stories, and exchanging philosophies on life. The cafe was still there, but the owner had changed. He asked about Eleanor, but no one remembered her. Next, he went to the beach where they used to walk hand in hand. The waves still crashed against the shore as they always had, but Eleanor was no longer beside him. Frank sat down on a bench, feeling the weight of loss heavier than ever. Finally, he found his way to Eleanor's old house. It now belonged to another family, but fortunately, he was able to find Margaret, Eleanor's close friend and longtime neighbor. When Margaret saw Frank, she froze. "Frank? My goodness! I never thought I'd see you again." Frank grasped her hand tightly. "Margaret, I need to know what happened to Eleanor. I got her messages. I didn't know." Margaret sighed, her aged eyes glistening with emotion. "Frank, Eleanor waited for your call for years. She never stopped loving you, but she was too proud to try again after you never responded. She had been sick for a long time, and that night, she truly needed you." Frank felt his heart shatter. "She tried to reach me, and I didn't answer." Margaret placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "Sometimes, we only realize what truly matters when it's too late. But Frank, maybe she's still out there, waiting for you to find the truth." Frank tightened his grip on the phone. He knew what he had to do next. He had to find a way to say goodbye to Eleanor, the way they both deserved. Frank stood before the iron gates of Havenwood Nursing Home, the place where Eleanor had spent her final years. His heart pounded as he stepped inside the main lobby, where the scent of antiseptic mingled with the faint aroma of tea. It felt as though he had stepped into a forgotten corner of time, a place where the past lingered just beneath the surface. A young nurse, Sarah, greeted him with a gentle smile. "Are you Frank Carter?" she asked, glancing at the old phone in his hand. Frank nodded. "I came to ask about Eleanor. She lived here in her final years, didn't she?" Sarah nodded and gestured for him to follow. They walked down a long hallway lined with quiet still life paintings. When they reached a small room, Sarah pushed open the door and pointed to a modest wooden nightstand beside the bed. "Eleanor spoke about you often," she said. "She kept this phone with her, even though it stopped working long ago. She would look at it, as if waiting for something." Frank picked up the old, worn-out phone resting on the table. It was identical to the one he held, except its screen was cracked, its edges scuffed by time. He ran his fingers over its surface, as if touching a piece of Eleanor's lingering soul. Sarah continued. In her final days, Eleanor would sit by the window, staring outside. Sometimes she mumbled to herself, but there was one thing she kept saying over and over again. "Frank, pick up. Please." Frank felt an invisible hand tighten around his heart. Eleanor had never stopped trying to reach him, even as her strength faded, and he had not been there. By the time he left the nursing home, dusk had settled. Frank drove home in silence, his mind weighed down by emotions too tangled to unravel. He knew that tonight would not be like any other night. Something he could not explain was waiting for him. That night, Frank sat on his bed, the dim glow of the bedside lamp casting long shadows across the worn-out walls. He held Eleanor's phone, staring at the dark screen. His thoughts swirled in chaos. Missed calls, unread messages, and Eleanor's final plea. He pressed the power button, but the phone did not turn on. The battery had long since died. Sighing, Frank set the phone down on the table and reached for the lamp switch. But just as he was about to turn off the light, a sound echoed through the room. Ring, ring. Frank froze. It was the sound of an incoming call. His gaze dropped to the table, and his breath caught in his throat. The screen of the old phone was glowing. His heart pounded as he read the words flashing on the screen. "Eleanor is calling." His breath came in ragged gasps. His hands trembled as he picked up the phone. This couldn't be real. The phone hadn't worked in years. Eleanor was gone. Then how? He hesitated for a long moment before finally pressing the answer button. Silence stretched on the other end, just for a few seconds before a voice emerged. A voice he never thought he would hear again. "Frank, you finally picked up." His entire body shook. That voice. It was Eleanor. But it wasn't frail like in the old voicemails he had replayed 1,000 times. It was clear, vibrant, as if she were standing right next to him. "Eleanor?" he whispered, his eyes wide in disbelief. "I've waited so long for you, Frank," she continued, her voice gentle but distant. "I don't blame you. I just needed you to know. I never stopped loving you." Tears welled in Frank's eyes. I'm sorry, Eleanor. I didn't know. I wasn't there when you needed me the most." There was a pause. Then, Eleanor let out a soft laugh, warm, familiar, heartbreakingly real. "You know, Frank, what matters isn't how long we were apart, but that we found each other again, even if it's late." Frank clutched the phone tighter, his heart shattering. "I wish I could turn back time. I wish I could have told you this sooner." Eleanor's voice remained tender. It's never too late to love someone, Frank. Remember that. Tears streamed down his face, but he couldn't speak. He could only listen. I'm not calling to blame you, Frank, Eleanor continued, her voice carrying no resentment, no anger, only peace. I just wanted to say goodbye. Frank's chest tightened, a pain deeper than anything he had ever felt before. Eleanor, I'm sorry. I didn't know. I left you alone when you needed me most. She sighed softly, as if smiling. Don't blame yourself, Frank. I had a good life, and I never regretted loving you. Even when we were apart, I always carried you in my heart. Frank closed his eyes, picturing Eleanor as he had always remembered her. Soft hair cascading over her shoulders, warm eyes full of kindness. A gentle smile meant just for him. I wish I could go back. I would never let you go. Eleanor chuckled, her voice like a whisper of wind. If there's one thing I want you to do, Frank, it's this. Don't let the past chain you anymore. Keep living. Let our love be a beautiful part of your life, not a burden. Frank choked back a sob. He wanted to hold onto this moment forever, but deep inside he knew it was ending. The connection started to waver. Eleanor's voice grew softer, like she was drifting away. Eleanor, don't go. Frank cried out, desperation gripping him. All that remained was the faint crackle of static. And then the screen went dark. Frank stared at the black void of the phone's display. He tried to turn it back on, pressing every button, but there was no response. No sign that the call had ever happened, no call log, no recording, nothing at all. But Frank knew it was real. He had heard Eleanor. She had called him. She had found him, if only for a fleeting moment. For a long time, Frank sat in silence, the phone still clutched in his hands. A quiet sadness settled over him, but it was no longer the unbearable weight it once was. It was softer now, like a gentle breeze, like the echo of an old melody, filled with longing, but also with beauty. He tried once more to turn on the phone, but it remained lifeless. The screen was dark, as if nothing had ever happened. Yet, Frank didn't panic. He didn't try again, because he knew Eleanor had truly said goodbye. The next morning, Frank stepped out onto his porch, breathing in the crisp, fresh air. For the first time in years, he felt lighter, as if a burden he had carried for too long had finally been lifted. For the first time, he no longer felt trapped in the past. And so, he decided to do something he had never considered before. He would write their story, not as a tragedy, but as a love song. A tale of two people who loved, lost, and somehow, in an impossible way, found each other again. And so, with a pen in hand, Frank began to write. Not to forget, but to remember, to keep their love alive, forever.
Thank you for listening. See you in the next stories. Please subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell to get updates on new videos. Thank you.